I'm going to talk about work with both primates and dogs. I'm going to actually focus a little bit more on the work with dogs, as Joanne said, especially the sort of the science or the discoveries we've made. But what I want to do is I want to relate the science that we've done and the discoveries we've made about dogs and dog psychology to the challenge of social housing. How do we think about welfare? How do we think about what social housing means for different species? And what I want to suggest to you today is I think that taking into account evolution will be very, very powerful as we go forward. All right, so I present a lot at a lot of different conferences in front of a lot of different audiences, and just like anyone who has their own area of research, I have my own methods that we have used and developed, and I have to say that sometimes it's a little intimidating to go to a conference where there are people presenting fMRI approaches or maybe genome comparisons, etc. And I rock up and I say, well, you know, we've made a whole bunch of discoveries about how the mind of animals works by putting food inside of a box and then closing it. But that's what I want to suggest to you today, is that methods as simple as putting food in a box and closing it can reveal much about the animal mind, not just species differences, but something we've been really interested in more recently, individual differences. What is it that makes an individual animal potentially different than another? So let me give you an example, just to let you see what I'm talking about. This is an extremely powerful test, believe it or not. This is our fMRI of dog phenotyping. Here we go. We put food in a box. The dog has been able to get food out of this box previously, but then as evil experimentalists, we seal the box and make it impossible for them to open. You're going to see this dog that is at the Canine Companions for Independence. It's a group that trains the largest number of assistance dogs placed out with people with mental and physical disabilities. This dog says, I can get it. This is my treat. I'm getting it myself. I don't need any help. Whatever you do. And we sped it up because this dog was so adamant about getting the food. So the next dog has a different approach. So this dog is from the exact same population, raised exactly the same way, trained exactly the same way, and it says, hey, human, you have a thumb. Get the thing. Come on. Hey, I can't get it out. I'm a dog. I'm a dog, guys. Help me. Help me. Okay? So it ends up that this simple test elicits very different responses across individuals in a population that has had closed breeding, has been reared, almost identically, and is being trained in a very, very similar way. And it ends up that the silly little test and the differences that we see here, they've really helped us identify what jobs each individual dog might be best at. So if you've got a group of puppy dogs that you're training to work, and let me just start out by saying, believe it or not, dogs have more jobs than ever now. They're very busy people, and just like if you have a group of undergraduates who you don't know what they're actually going to end up majoring in and what major they should major in and what would be best for them when they come in as your student, it's the same with these cute little puppies up here. They all have different cognitive profiles, I would suggest to you, and the question is, which cognitive profile is best for which job? Because it ends up, because dogs have all these different jobs, well, there are different things that they need to be able to do at all of these different jobs. So how do you know which dog is the right dog for the different jobs they are asked to do? So whether it's being a pet or finding IEDs or helping a child as a therapy dog or being a service dog for somebody who's wheelchair bound. So that's our challenge. And what we found with the little games that we play, and we played dozens of them and looked at individual differences, is that the games that that game that I just showed you, it really helped discriminate between dogs that would be excellent bomb detecting dogs and dogs that would be really helpful at helping those with mental and physical disabilities. So you can imagine the first dog that's trying to solve the problem on its own, probably not the dog you're going to put with a person with disabilities. The second dog is fantastic, communicative, very attentive, worried, trying to figure out what the human could do with them together and cooperate. So it ends up that these little games are it ends up not just, we don't just find a correlation. We did find correlations with these different games with performance, but then we went back and tried to predict which dogs would be best at which job, each different job, and we were able to predict with higher accuracy which dogs would be better at what job. So, how did we do this? How did we end up with this little game where we put food in a box? It's ridiculous. Of course we were embarrassed to say that this is what we were doing when we explained to our colleagues that, we were going to spend weeks and use tons of their time to put food in a box. They think we're ridiculous. Well, the reason that we got there and the reason that we were able to stand up and, say that this is really important to do is because we were using an evolutionary approach to cognitive abilities. And the idea is that each species is different. They have different cognitive abilities, and that there are different cognitive abilities that vary independently within species and across species. So this is a very different way to view the world than there's some general principle like learning ability or the ability to solve problems, some general principle. Really the idea is there's different types of cognition, it varies independently, you can measure it, and it predicts what different animals might be good at. So take for instance the species up on this slide. I get asked this question by people in the media all the time. Which species is smarter? Tell me, is it cat or dog in the war? Tell me, are cats or dogs the smart ones? And so I really frustrate people in the media because I refuse to answer their question. And what I always respond is, asking me that is like asking me which is a better tool, a hammer or a screwdriver. Am I hammering or am I screwing in a screw? Because the minds of animals are designed the exact same way. They have evolved to solve the problems, to be really, really good at solving the problems that they need to solve in the ecologies that they evolved within. And so if we want to understand how cognition is interacting with the environment and how best to utilize that cognition or to take care of that cognition in the case of welfare, then appreciating that cognition evolves, I think, is a very powerful way forward. So for instance, all these species up here, you might think, well, what in the world could the fish possibly be on that slide for? Of course, the fish isn't particularly smart. What about the birds? Well, if I just sort of say the highlights of all these different species, each of these species have an incredible, unique capability, and there are others as well. And each of them could outperform all the other species on this slide if you were to give them the task or the problem that they are designed and evolved to solve in a flexible, spontaneous manner. So thinking about the evolution of cognition, I would submit to you, is a very powerful way to solve problems. Okay, so the challenge that we have here, and I think our hypothesis is that happier animals are going to lead to better translational science. And I've given you the first example, I think, is that we were tasked by the Office of Naval Research to help them select better dogs. We were tasked by the National Institute of Health, help us select better dogs. And by using evolution, we were able to do that. We came up with our silly little task to put food in a box and all the others. So I want to tell you a little bit about the story of how that happened. Okay, but before I do, I want to introduce you, in case you have never heard of Nico Tinbergen, the Nobel laureate in ethology, because really when I'm talking about an evolutionary approach to behavior, I'm talking about Nico Tinbergen's 4 levels of analysis. I don't think we can make progress, for instance, with social housing if we don't consider a species' phylogeny, if we don't consider their ontogeny, and if we don't think about functional explanations for mechanism. I think that function often will help us predict what mechanisms that we want to understand better. So taking into account phylogeny, ontogeny, function proximate, to understand proximate mechanisms is going to be a theme throughout everything you're going to see. I'm not going to highlight every time I talk about or use these things, but I hope what you'll note is throughout all the things that I'm going to present today, wow, I'm really bouncing between these different levels of explanation. I'm not just focused on mechanism. I appreciate that to understand whatever mechanism it is, I must take into account these other levels of analyses. Okay, and the prediction that I would submit to you is that if we want happier animals and better translational science, that really taking the evolutionary approach that I'm going to try to outline for you today is going to be the most powerful tool to improving welfare. And of course, what am I talking about? Obviously, I think at the core of everything that we hope to accomplish as a community is highlighted by the 3 R's, and they're defined here. I just grabbed this, actually. I just Googled, the 3 R's, and this came up, which was kind of cool that it was there and available. And these are the definitions that were on somebody's slide deck that I stole off Google. Sorry, whoever it is. But the reason I did it is I wanted to remind myself, well, how is it that people think about the 3 R's? And actually, when I looked at these definitions, I thought, man, I thought I was doing the 3 R's, but I don't really think that I fit this definition. And I think it's important for the rest of our time together because in some ways, I'm sort of an odd fit for the goals here because I actually don't have any animals in a laboratory that I study. Everything that I do are animals that somebody else owns. And so I always joke that I'm the ultimate mooch. If you have animals, I might have a conversation with you. And so what I would do is I would say, this is how I've approached the 3 R's. It's slightly different, and I'm not suggesting that that's going to be appropriate for those of you doing work with laboratory animals. But I just want to tell you that this is what I came up with is, wow, if I'm going to meet the 3 R's and for the goals of my non-invasive research, I actually don't want a controlled environment. I want the animals I'm working with in the richest possible environment. I want them to be in an environment as close to what they might experience in nature as possible because I want them to show the most sophisticated cognitive abilities that they could possibly demonstrate. Otherwise, I won't be able to test the hypotheses I'm interested in a powerful way. So I don't want them in laboratories, number one. Number two is, for the purposes of what I do, there wasn't that much funding for laboratory work. And then number three is, a lot of the questions that I wanted to answer, it just wouldn't be possible to work in a laboratory to answer them. So, so this was the sort of 3R approach I came up with. And as a first example of this, I want to introduce you to the approach we developed at the Duke Canine Cognition Center. So at Duke, Nate already told me he's buddies with Ron Banks, and you can imagine I show up as an assistant professor at Duke University, and I have my first meeting with Ron, and Ron was in charge of the ICAAT committee and OLAW and all that good stuff. And he says, well, Dr. Hare, I got this email here that you want to study people's pet dogs. We don't have a way to deal with that with our normal procedures, but it seems like this is something that could be important, so I want to work with you. And it was amazing. He was genius and came up with a workaround so that Duke could feel comfortable, the IACAT committee could feel comfortable, OLAW could feel comfortable with me inviting people in the community to bring their pet dogs to the Duke Canine Cognition Center, which is only called a center because people probably didn't want to bring their dogs to the Duke Canine Cognition Laboratory. And so we have 1,500 pet owners in the Triangle area that bring their pet dogs. And in the beginning, I thought, well, this might work once. Maybe they'll bring their dogs one time, and we won't ask that much the first time. And it ends up that we have a 99% success rate. If we call one of our people and say, can you bring your dog on X date, and we find a good time for them, they come and they show up. This is based on the developmental psychology model. And in developmental psychology, where you invite people's children to come in, your success rate is around 25%. Having 2 young children, I completely understand that. It's like, sure, I'll be there. Yeah, I'll bring my kid, no problem. Maybe. But when you have dog owners, they're so enthusiastic and they so badly want to participate that we have never had a problem. So I've never paid a vet bill. I've never had to pay for food. I've never had to pay for anything for these animals. And I have the largest population of captive dogs to study at any university when we start. So that was the model, and now we've invited different people now 7, 8 times to participate. People keep coming back. Unless their dog dies, we're in great shape. So it's been really exciting to see the enthusiasm of the local community. Okay, so how in the world did I get started studying dogs? Well, the answer is I was really interested in, I was a student of Mike Tomasello. I actually went to Emory University, and I met and I took classes with Franz de Waal here as well. And I started out at Yerkes studying chimpanzees. And what we were doing was we were trying to test the idea that human cognition, the unique feature of human cognition that develops very early in our lives, is our ability to understand gestural communication. That when we gesture and we try to tell young children, or children start to gesture to us, or start co-orienting, when I gaze, you might follow my gaze, that these at around 9 to 12 months when they first start to appear are sort of revolutionary moments in the development of human social cognition that indicate that young children are starting to participate in culture, and that if you want to learn language, these skills have to develop. Okay, so that's an incredible hypothesis. I'm 19 years old and somebody's telling me that little kids are a window into understanding our evolutionary history and sort of what is unique and special about our species relative to other animals. Man, all right. So Mike Thomas says, go out to Yerkes. I want you to work with Joseph Call, and you're going to sit in front of some of the chimpanzees, and you're just going to hide food and then tell them where you hid it. And that's the game you're going to play. You're going to hide food in one of two places, and you're going to sort of gesture, point, look, move towards wherever the food's hidden. Oh my God, they're terrible. Bless Ty's heart, bless Erica's heart. You'll meet them, hopefully some of them, Donna, others at the field station. Oh, they were terrible at this. They're brilliant in so many ways, but this was really, really difficult for them. So Mike Tomasello just told me the story that I told you, and he said, wow, we're finding that chimpanzees are, as smart as they are at so many other things, they really aren't very good at this gestural communication stuff. So now I know that this is completely unique to our species, and it must be really important in human evolution. Well, I grew up in Atlanta, and this was my pet dog growing up, Oreo, and I said to Mike, I think my dog can do this. I think my dog can do that. I think my dog can use gestures, because growing up just down the street with this guy, he wasn't different than any other Labrador Retriever. He was obsessed with playing fetch, just like every Labrador Retriever is. But he did one funny thing, is he did like to have 2 tennis balls or 3 tennis balls at all times, which he would cover in massive amounts of slobber. And so then you would throw them, those big slobber balls, off in the distance. But the thing is, when he came back with the first one, he wasn't happy for you to then throw the same ball again. He wanted to find the second ball, okay? So he'd come back with the first one, and then he would drop it, and he would start barking incessantly until you gestured in the direction that the second ball had been thrown. So then he would run off and orbit in that direction. So I just grew up. I was trained by this dog that this is what dogs do. It never occurred to me that this was in any way special or interesting. So Mike Tomasello says this is completely unique to humans. And I say, no, I think my dog can do this. So Mike, being a great scientist, at first says, well, everybody says their dog can do calculus. And I said, no, really. And my dog can do, I tell the story I just told you. And he says, well, you seem really serious. So this is a great moment in science where I learned what science is. He said, I will help you figure out how to prove me wrong. Let's do an experiment. And we did a whole series of experiments, and it ends up that Oreo, the pet dog that I tested and started all this stuff in a garage in Atlanta, in my parents' garage, we found out dogs are really good at this. And it's not a silly parlor trick. It's not like it's something they do inflexibly and they've learned. It seems that they understand how we're gesturing to them, and they pass all the same kind of tests that we give young children and attribute an understanding of communication intention to them. They're passing all the same games that we couldn't even try with the chimps at Yerkes, because they couldn't even pass the most basic things in this area. Okay, so here's an example of what it looks like. This is Fifi. This is actually in Leipzig, Germany. Fifi is just looking for the grape. There's the grape there. It's like an R01 grant for her. Get it, gotta get it. And I'm just gonna tell her where it is. There it is. And she chooses the wrong one, scratches her head. Oh, this is so hard and confusing. And if you play this game over and over and over, you'd predict that they would get better, right? They would sort of slowly go above chance. Even they could slowly learn this. I mean, you're talking hundreds of trials before they start performing above chance. And it's simply because, and we'll get there, that it really is all about the context. So here is the silly mutt in Germany again. Never seen this game before. Played the exact same game, and you'll see the dog's going to say, well, why didn't you just hand it to me? And what we found was that when we compared a group of dogs to a group of chimpanzees, we use this novel cue, putting the block on top, because the idea is this is something they've never seen before. We can control for things like olfaction. It's not that the dogs just smell where the food is. It's also not that the dogs are just using your motion. They really do seem to understand, even though they've never seen this arbitrary novel cue. Oh, you're just trying to tell me where it is. Okay, sure, I can use that. And they'll do it on trial 1, no problem. So it ends up, this was a big thing in the news when it came out, oh, dogs are smarter than chimpanzees, okay, which of course, you know, as somebody who just presented to you the cognitive approach to cognition, hammer and screwdriver, it was sort of depressing that that was the headline, you know, because yes, if it was dogs are smarter than chimpanzees when it comes to communicating with humans, I'd have been happy with that, because of course chimpanzees in many ways can run circles around dogs. All right, so subsequently, since we published this first finding, we said, well, is this really true? Let's go big with this, because if it is true, it could be really useful and important, not only in a basic sense to test evolutionary ideas, but also in a more applied sense. So what we did is we tested hundreds of kids, we tested hundreds of dogs, and we tested over 100 chimpanzees that were totally novel to all the cognitive testing, or naive to the cognitive testing, and we tested them on over 24 cognitive a set of over 24 cognitive measures. And the idea here is that really if the social communicative stuff is somehow unique and special to dogs, well, it should be that those games are where dogs are really different and maybe even more similar to human infants than other things, let's say like spatial memory or inhibitory control. In those domains, in the non-social things, well, dogs probably aren't very different than many other mammals, if this really is that the social cognition in dogs is somehow unique and special. Okay, so we threw the kitchen sink at it. We came up with as many games as we could to measure a variety of cognitive abilities. But interestingly, what we did is 4 of the social games that we tested across these 3 species and 4 of the non-social tests were exactly the same for dog, human, chimpanzee. Okay? And this is what we found when we looked at all these different species' performance on all these different cognitive measures. Well, it ends up that if you need to know directions or you want to understand something like gravity or connectivity, don't ask your dog. Please don't ask your dog. Your dog doesn't have a clue. Anything that has to do with the physical world, dogs are completely lost. Okay? But where they're genius, the one species that is most similar to 2.5-year-old children when it comes to using gestural communication, understanding communicative intention, and knowing how to understand others, if the other is a human, it's a dog. Dogs are genius, and what makes them remarkable relative to other species is their ability to communicate with humans. Well, in some sense, it's like, well, I'm sure many of you live with dogs. It's like, yes, we knew that. Okay, but the neat thing is the comparison to different species. Okay, so let's continue that comparison and not look at just mean performance of a group of dogs versus a group of other species. What about individual differences? I promised you we would talk about individual differences. So this is like a phylogeny of the relationship of performance across these 8 tasks that I told you that were the same across the 3 different species. And what I want you to think about is in math class, they would say you were good at math if they could give you one equation and you could solve it, and that would then predict that you could solve all the other equations that they might give you, okay? And if you were good at English, they said, write an essay about Shakespeare, and that meant, ooh, you could really, really write a good essay about another author that they wanted you to write about, okay? So writing one good essay would predict that you could write another good essay. But writing about Shakespeare doesn't predict what you would do on those equations. And being able to solve the equation wouldn't be able to predict what you would do on the essays. That's the idea that there are these different domains of cognition, that there really is something called English ability and math ability. So what we're looking at in the case of these animals compared to kids is social skill versus non-social skill. And the prediction is if these things really are different, as I suggested to you in the beginning, that they should actually correlate to one another in terms of performance. The social measures, if you're good at one of the social measures, that should be related to your performance on all the other social measures. If you're good at the non-social measures, that should be related to your performance on all the non-social measures. And actually the relationship is true if you actually do badly on one, you should do badly on the others. Okay, so this is what we find with the human kids. that human kids that do really well on some of the social measures in orange, well, they do well on the social measures, on the other social measures. And same for non-social. What happens when we look at chimpanzees? Well, it ends up that these things aren't related. It does seem in the case of chimpanzees that they're probably using some general purpose mechanism to try to solve the social problems. And the pattern of individual differences between human infant and chimpanzee really looks different here. So that's really interesting. And that does replicate a larger effort we made comparing chimps and humans. What about dogs? Well, when we looked at dogs, dogs actually have an even more pronounced relationship between these different domains of cognition. So if you were to ask me, name a non-human species that is most like humans when it comes to the cognitive skills that allow for language and culture, I would say a dog. I would not say a chimpanzee or a primate. It's actually a dog. The dogs have skills that we think are crucial for developing language and culture. It just happens they're in a canine mind, not in a primate brain. So that's convergent. Convergence in terms of psychology potentially is what I'm suggesting to you. But what I want to now turn to is the idea that it's not just convergence in psychology by accident, it's convergence through evolution. And that actually it's the process of domestication that led to the patterns we see here. Okay, so we tested wolves and we tested young dog puppies, and it ends up the relationships that I just explained to you hold. So wolves look like chimpanzees when we play these types of games, and young dog puppies actually are very skilled, even as young as 6 to 9 weeks old. They're just as skilled as adult dogs at solving many of the basic social tasks we're talking about. So that was a big surprise. That's not what we thought. We thought that you'd really have to train dogs to be able to use the social gestures and really do a lot of repetitive training. It ends up young dogs, young dog puppies with very little exposure to humans are very good at understanding and reading humans. So that seems to be there's an early emerging set of skills in dogs. Okay, so we suggested that this was a result of domestication, this cognitive profile. But how would you test that? Short of grabbing up a bunch of wolves and starting breeding them selectively, and how would we answer it? And then what would we breed them for? What would we be selecting on? On what basis? Well, thankfully, just by traveling to Siberia, which I did, I got to work with Dmitry Belayev's experimentally domesticated foxes on the fox farm run by the Institute of Cytology and Genetics. And what they selected for over 60 years was friendliness. So if foxes were friendly in the experimental population, they bred them together and they allowed them to have puppies. So 1% of each generation was allowed to have puppies, and that was based on a very standardized test where literally they just went and they stood in front, say this is the fox, they went and stood in front of the fox, they looked at what their behavior was, then they put their hand on the cage, then they opened the door and put their hand in the cage, and then they tried to pick the fox up. Okay, and so they measured on a scale, 1 through 4, what the reaction of the fox was to the human. You can imagine doing this with a rhesus macaque. It might take a while. So they started with a wild population, actually, a wild population of foxes. And so after 60 years, they have effectively experimentally domesticated the population of foxes. And the reason that they know this is because they brilliantly kept a line as a control that they bred randomly for how they respond to humans. And when you compare the experimental line to the control line, and the two populations were kept in absolutely identical situation in terms of their care and what they ate, etc. What you see is not only the predicted changes in friendliness towards people, but you also see a set of morphological changes, you see a set of physiological changes, and you also see changes in how they breed and their reproductive behavior. So it ends up that this is the breeding season for the experimental line, and this is the breeding season for the control line. So instead of being able to reproduce for 6 weeks, they can now reproduce for 6 months. And their development is different as well. They have an expanded window of development in the control versus in the experimental line. So you can socialize the experimental line earlier, you can socialize them for longer to human contact, and there are all sorts of other patterns in development where you see expanded windows of development. None of these things were selected. They selected for none of these traits. They all came along as byproducts of selection for friendliness. And there's a question as to what the mechanism might be. One idea is that it's pleiotropic, but it's a developmental story. Early in the development of the neural crest, as stem cells are migrating throughout the body and there's induction as these cells travel throughout the body, stem cells that emanate from the neural crest are involved in melanocyte development, in development of cartilage, bone, and also the HPA axis as well. And so if you want to downregulate the HPA axis, well, you're actually by accident going to affect all these other traits because they're developmentally linked due to the neural crest. It's a hypothesis. There might be other good ones, but the phenomenon that needs to be explained is real and I think very exciting. But I study cognition, so what did I do with the wolves? Well, this is a video of wolves, but what did we do with the foxes? Well, what we did with the foxes was exactly what we did here with these wolves. We just gave one of our simple little social cue tests. Actually, we gave a series of them. Here's an example of one of them with a wolf pup. This is a wolf pup in Minnesota. There's a sanctuary with about 70 wolves up there, and every summer they tend to have a few litters, so we go and study the wolves there. It's always difficult to get students. It involves bottle feeding wolves for weeks, by the way, before you even get to this moment. So here's the data. And remember Tinberg, and thinking about ontogeny, phylogeny, and function, I think we've got it all covered on this one slide. So looking at young fox pups, and here are your experimental foxes in control, and here are your dogs and your wolves, what I would submit to you is we have evidence for convergent cognitive evolution as a result of domestication. And basically, by selecting the foxes to be friendly, you changed how the foxes viewed humans. They no longer viewed them as predators or something to be feared, something to be worried about, but they actually viewed they viewed humans as social partners, as someone to be attracted to, someone to interact with. And I can tell you, having hung out with the foxes, they want to jump in your arms, and that is what they want in their life. It is what they are motivated for, and they are so excited. And if you pick one up, it's so wonderful, and they hug you, and they chirp, and they make these little sounds, even as adults, that they make when they're puppies, and it's quite endearing, except for then they pee for joy all over you, and they have musk glands, and you smell the rest of the day like you've been loved by a fox. So anyway, especially if you have to repeat this process many times. So the idea is, after controlling for development, looking at an experimental selection of friendliness, what you see is if you want a clever fox, and actually this is not what I predicted the result would be. If you want a clever fox, you don't select for cleverness, you select for friendliness. And you get a socially clever fox as a result. Just like floppy ears and curly tails are a byproduct of selection against aggression, so too, it seems, social cognition is a byproduct of selection for friendliness. Okay, and the idea is that if you want to explain dog domestication, Belayev has given us the most beautiful model to do so. And it's very, very clear now what domestication is. Domestication is selection for friendliness towards people and selection against fear and aggression towards people. So I submit to you that this could be relevant now to thinking about social housing and welfare. One of the other things that's really interesting that's been discovered just this year is that I'm sure many of you have been in this situation before where the dog is staring at you and you're like, what? What do you want? No, you can't have my food or whatever. And so one of the really exciting findings is, and of course many of you probably, if I asked you, do you love your dog? You'd say, of course I love my dog. I love my dog. And we might have horrible philosophical debates about, can a dog love us? But nobody would probably want to have the same debate with anybody about whether they love their dog because they might get in trouble. And so what I can tell you is that the physiological response that we see or are observed between parent and offspring, it's also occurring between dog and human. Just this couple of years ago, there was sort of the final cherry on top of the cake, showing that there seems to be an oxytocin loop between human and dog. That when you're making eye contact or you're petting your dog, it's creating oxytocin in you, it's creating oxytocin in the dog, and the bond and the love that you're feeling, it's real. There's a physiological explanation for why we care so much about our dogs. And what was also really interesting is that doesn't exist in human-wolf interactions. When wolves are raised by people, even for their entire life, you do not get the oxytocin loop. It does seem that this is a product of domestication. Now, we haven't tested it in the foxes. Wouldn't that be great? But the prediction would be that probably the experimental foxes would show something more like what dogs show. All right, so because of this work that I just presented to you, we suggested the self-domestication hypothesis, and thankfully I'm not going to tell you about how I think it helps explain many different evolutionary events, but the idea is that selecting for friendliness, yes, that's artificial selection in the case of the foxes, but if you're telling me that all domestication is selection for friendliness, interacting with people, or maybe even selection for friendliness, interacting with conspecifics, well, that opens the door for natural selection. That perhaps selection for friendliness is a process that's occurred through natural selection, and we've gone and compared lots of different species and tried to think about, is this same process we've seen in the foxes, can we observe it in other places in nature? So everything from bonobos to our own species, even this is the deer that lives in my neighborhood, and I would submit to you that it's not chance that we have an extremely rare albino deer walking up our driveway and eating our azaleas. Okay, because I think it's a process of self-domestication. Okay, and let's just do this with dogs, though, really quickly. Here I am with a group of wolf pups. These are all wolf pups that have been raised by people. They're very familiar with people. They were taken away from their moms very, very early, and they want nothing to do with me. The only reason they approach is, you can't really see it, but there's kibble all across the ground that they're actually not interested in approaching me. They just are trying to get close enough to get the kibble. Again, these are wolves raised by people, but they want nothing to do with a strange human. Meanwhile, to get the photo, there was actually a dog in here, and it was running around, and we had to wait to take the photo until the dog was out of the photo because it wouldn't be as cool. I haven't met the dog. I mean, the dog is, I don't know this dog. So the point is that dogs love people. They're attracted. They want to be with us. They actually prefer us. And the thinking goes, with the self-domestication hypothesis for dog evolution, is that there's individual variability 40 to 50,000 years ago when we know dogs started to evolve from wolves. And think now, 40 to 50,000 years ago, there's no agriculture, okay? This is way before agriculture. So how did this interaction happen, and how did wolves evolve 40 to 50,000 years ago when we know from genetic comparisons this is when the population started to diverge? Well, the idea goes there's individual variability. As humans become more sedentary, starting around 40,000 years ago, we do what we do best. We create a lot of garbage, and guess what? Human garbage is fantastic if you are a population of wolves that is not fearful and is if you're individual wolves who are not fearful and you're attracted to humans more than your other wolf brethren. So the idea would be, if you could take advantage of all the new garbage, you have this amazing resource, a new ecological niche to exploit. There's one thing you need to be friendly and non-aggressive and attracted to people. So that kickstarts the evolutionary process, and I would love to tell you more about this idea. But the punchline is you end up with these animals as a result of natural selection. Humans didn't wake up one day and say, oh, it'd be great. Let's go catch some wolves. And while we're hunting and gathering 40,000 years ago, let's leave them with our kids. Wouldn't that be great? Isn't that a great idea? And then we'll get twice as much food today so we can also feed the wolves. No, that's not what happened. I think wolves chose us, and they wouldn't go away. And as a result of a natural process, they were self-selected, and they were domesticated through a process that Belayev brilliantly, together with Ludmila Trut, has elucidated for us. So if you want to understand how this has to do with human evolution, what this has to do with the evolution of even bonobos, and dogs, I wrote a review for the Annual Review of Psychology that just came out this year. I would invite you to go enjoy it. But what I want to turn to now is I want to say, okay, I told you the dog story and the evolutionary story, and I want to remind you how we started, because how we started is how I finished. I didn't start with the cute little game and the food in the box. I started with what I just told you. We did really great evolutionary work and detective work trying to figure out what makes a dog special and remarkable, and how have they done this incredible trick to evolve from wolf to dog and be so successful and live on every continent with us and have us love and adore them. And the answer is they've evolved not just in terms of their morphology and behavior, but also their cognition. They have converged with how our own cognition works. Okay, so given that, and given the model that we used, testing people's pet dogs and other working dogs, I want to take you out and just show you, well, okay, that's great, it worked for you. What about other people? And it's catching on. So there are now 6 universities and that I highlighted in this slide, but there's actually many more I could have put up here. And I actually would submit to you that the dog is going to save comparative psychology because it puts comparative psychology work in a very unique place where I think most science would like to be. Instead of being you cost a lot of money and maybe or maybe not there's a lot of money for your research, we are extremely cheap, we cost almost nothing, and we can bring in a lot of money. So universities like that. And so we've been very successful at bringing in money, except for we have almost no overhead by studying people's pets. Okay, so that's why I think you're going to see a lot more canine cognition centers in the United States, which is really exciting. And think about it, because the challenges we have with, say, primates, and I'm going to tell you about my love of great apes in a second. I love great apes, but the challenge there is, for instance, I study bonobos in Congo. Well, guess what? I am the only person that necessarily has access at any time to the world's largest population of bonobos. I have 70 bonobos I can work with. No one else has 70 bonobos they can work with. So how's anybody ever going to replicate anything I do? So it's actually quite depressing from a scientific perspective. I want people to be able to replicate my work, potentially falsify it, and move things forward so we reveal the truth. Dogs don't have that problem. Also, it's wonderful when you're piloting. You no longer have to worry about, well, I only have 6 apes I can do this with, so I have to be really careful as I'm piloting that I don't burn one of my subjects. With dogs, yeah, whatever, just pilot. It doesn't matter. If you mess up, we'll get more. So it's so nice. Okay. And remember, we play fun games, and this is to emphasize that. So the thought occurred, well, wait a second. Given there are 1,500 people in the Triangle area that like to do this, why are we keeping this to ourselves? I mean, not all science is rocket science. Maybe we could use this as a real opportunity to educate people about what science is, and what if we could get people to collect data for us and pay us for it? So we said, why not? Let's try. So we came up with the concept of dognition, and the idea is let's get people to play cognitive games with their dogs. We'll provide video instruction of how to do it, and you can go to dognition.com right now and check it out. You can play with your dog if you want. It costs $20. It is a company, and it is for profit. But the idea is we provide games that you can play. You have an interface on your phone or your iPad or whatever, and you can tell us what your dog did as you play these games. Of course, we're collecting all the data, and we have a huge database now of over 25,000 dogs that have played these games. But at the same time, you get a report, and it tells you how your dog performed on these different cognitive measures compared to all the other dogs that have played these games. And the idea is to try to help people understand that it's not that your dog is smart or not, because that's what people always say to me, my dog is so dumb or my dog is so smart. And I always think in my head, compared to what and on what measure. And so that's what this solves, is compared to other dogs across 5 different measures of cognition, you can see how your dog does. And what's interesting is, of course, there's many, many different cognitive profiles, and people are always really surprised and excited to see how their dogs do. So there's the selfish motivation to learn more about your dog, but at the same time, you're being altruistic and providing a great service to the community. We tested whether this data has anything to tell us, because, of course, the worry was, could people really do these games at home, and would it be useful at all? And I was ready to, publish a paper and say, no, it's not useful. It's a great educational tool, but we're not going to be able to use the data. But when we did the analysis, it ends up that really the citizen scientists replicated all the main findings because all the games we used were out of the literature. We didn't just make them up. We took games right out of the public literature and provided them for people. And we found beautiful evidence for these different cognitive abilities. And it was the first demonstration, actually, that the cognitive abilities that I pitched to you actually do really exist in non-humans. So high five for citizen science and deputizing all these people. It means we can answer a whole bunch of questions because we have large sample sizes, whether it's breed differences, diet, development, aging, how you train your dog, and then we can look across the world because we actually have data from over 25,000 dogs. 25% of those are actually from a worldwide sample from over 200 countries, or different regions. So that's quite exciting. And so what I'd submit to you is that studying dogs really does meet my own criteria for the 3 R's, and I think it's a very powerful model. So what I want to turn to next, though, is not everybody can study dogs, and not everybody's interested in dogs, and of course, not just a non-invasive approach. So what about great apes? And what I want to, or primates, I should say more general, and other species as well. So let me just stop here and just check on time. How am I doing on time? Because I want to make sure. 10 to 15 minutes, no problem. Okay, so I have 10 to 15 minutes, and what I want to do is introduce you to where I study non-human primates, and then I'm going to literally blast through some of the findings, like click, 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 and just tell you what they were. And then I want to finally get to the end of the talk where I'm going to talk about more what do we do with laboratory science and how do we use an evolutionary approach in that way. So forgive me for going fast here, but I just want to make sure I have enough time to cover the meat. All right. So what's wrong with this video? The first thing is it's going to play upside down, which is quite entertaining. I don't know why. I've never seen this before. It's only unique to this room. Besides the fact that it's playing upside down, what's wrong with this video? So you have my daughter playing with a chimpanzee. It's quite cute. It looks like a modern facility. If you can turn your head upside down, you'll see that. Well, what's wrong with the video is it ends up that this was in China. And we went to the Beijing Zoo on purpose to visit these chimpanzees because they were not only being used in entertainment, but we know that they were illegally exported using illegal CITES permits from Western Africa, and that there's been an epidemic where over 150 chimpanzees were illegally exported. We know now that it's far more than that and more places as well. And as you can see from the slide, it's not just zoos that are doing this or entertainment facilities. It's also, unfortunately, there's a burgeoning pet trade as well. So if you're worried about great ape survival, this is really the big problem that needs to be solved. Because having a perceived market is bad enough, but actually having a real market is even worse. Apes are being sold for $50,000 to $300,000 to zoos to be exported directly out of Africa to the Middle East and China. Okay, so where do I work? Well, I work with sanctuaries. There are 19 sanctuaries in Africa that are on the front lines of preventing the illegal trade, the illegal pet trade, and bushmeat trade of great apes. It means that they provide lifetime care for hundreds of individuals all over Africa. I work at Lolea Bonobo, which I already mentioned. They have the world's largest population of bonobos. Unfortunately, there are hundreds of infants in these sanctuaries, but if you happen to be me, who I study developmental psychology, that's wonderful, because I have hundreds of ape infants, and not just chimpanzee infants, and not just East African chimpanzees, but I have West and Central, and I also have bonobo infants, so I can do some really nice comparisons that would be impossible otherwise. And relevant to the conference, they all are socially housed, and they live in beautiful forests like this. This is Lolea Bonobo. All the apes I work with are in primary forest, and they experience a microcosm of what any ape would experience in the wild. They're orphans, unfortunately, so they do get raised by people before they're introduced. They're peer-reared in a nursery group, not unlike what used to happen here at Yerkes, and then they're introduced into social groups and these large forests. This is actually one of my subjects, so when I told you I want ecological relevance, I wasn't joking. This is one of the guys that we get to work with. I think most vets would be really nervous about this, but he was fine. So they live in these really rich environments, and they live in really rich social environments. Okay, so this is what they look like when they come in, and this is Lomela. Then this is Lomela a year later. And this is where Lomela is now. Lomela started out at the sanctuary here in Kinshasa, and then she moved to Basankusu, which I've had the pleasure of visiting in the deepest, darkest heart of Africa. And there she is in the wild. So the goal of the sanctuary is to take these orphans, rehabilitate them, and then get them back out into the wild, which we've successfully done. And we've actually, of the 15 bonobos we've released, 13 of them are still out there and doing great. We did lose 2. But I'm a psychologist and interested in evolution. I've become interested in health as a result of my work in the sanctuaries, and these sanctuaries, I'd submit to you, have become really a fantastic resource for anybody interested in non-invasive work with great apes or veterinary work. And so I just want to roll through some of the discoveries. We had, this is just to say, you can do the best science at these sanctuaries. This was a study that showed that social and non-social cognition differed between great apes and kids. This was the first successful experiment studying chimpanzee cooperation. This was the first developmental comparison of bonobos and chimpanzees showing that the two species differ in how they develop. If you're interested in studying the development of spatial cognition, don't choose bonobos because it doesn't develop. And there are other things as well that are really interesting about the two species being very unique in terms of how they develop. Now, in relative to social housing, this is probably the most important finding, so I'll spend an extra second on this one. This was, we released chimpanzees and bonobos into an enclosure where there was food that they could potentially share. In anticipation of realizing that they might have to share the food and knowing who they were going to be going into the room with, we were able to detect differences in how the two species respond to this social stressor. So chimpanzees, as you might predict, these are all males, by the way, they have no response to this situation in terms of their cortisol levels, but they do have a big uptick in their testosterone. Basically, it seems like they're getting primed for social competition. Bonobos, who are nearly genetically identical, isn't a chimpanzee a chimpanzee? The answer is no. Bonobos have a huge cortisol spike before they go in to this situation. No testosterone spike. Again, these are all males. The same exact social context leads to a totally different physiological response in the two species nearly identical. So you might conclude, oh my gosh, bonobos get really stressed out in social groups, so don't put them together, and cortisol is such a great measure of social stress. Kind of. I mean, I don't disagree that, I mean, you use cortisol as a measure of stress. I don't disagree with that, except for it ends up that bonobos, when you put them together, never fight, share the food, and because they have this big stress response, they hug and have sociosexual contact, which I then think releases a whole bunch of oxytocin, reducing the cortisol and prevents any aggression. So because we understand their social system and the evolution of their social behavior, we interpret this differently than we might just by saying, oh, they have high cortisol, they must be stressed. Actually, this is a wonderful response. This is the correct response. It's not the incorrect or bad response, and you wouldn't want to keep them in a non-social environment as a result of this. Okay, so I just present that as a challenge to using our physiological measures. This is a paper that came out in Nature this year. I think it really challenges our idea about energy budgets in humans. Basically, humans we're the SUV of the ape world. We use way more energy than other apes. I think it has huge implications for how we think about obesity. Nobody had measured total energy expenditure in great apes in comparison to hunter-gatherers and modern humans, and it totally destroys the idea that the more you exercise, the less you eat, the more energy and calories you're going to burn. It's not a trade-off model. Instead, we're the high-energy ape. You'll have to read the paper to understand what I'm talking about. I apologize because I got to get through. But I just want to highlight that we're discovering big things by using these sanctuaries. One Health, we're also doing health research. This is the demographic model that Lisa Faust at the Franklin Park Zoo helped us with. What we realized, and we knew already, was that when we lose animals, it's to respiratory disease. At Yerkes, I know long struggles with respiratory and heart. If animals die, that's one of the big things for the great apes. So we see the same thing in Africa. So our question was, could we do anything about it? We invited Chris Woods and Annie Ramoyne to help us with sort of an epidemiological assessment. So we've done a longitudinal set of health checks of both staff and our animals. We also did what I think is the first respiratory cluster study on non-human apes in situ. So we've basically, anytime any individual had respiratory symptoms, we measured them and we measured their nearest neighbors over a series of days and got blood samples, et cetera. So we can now, it's just our samples are at Duke now and they've just begun investigating. Again, it's not just us. Lots of people from lots of great places are using the sanctuaries now to study great apes on a whole host of issues. And I think they're really serious, wonderful places. Okay, so I told you in the case of my work, non-invasive work, more or less non-invasive work that's in the interest of the animals, is either veterinary work or sort of potentially enriching fun games, how to use the 3 R's. But I think in the case of laboratory, I actually think these definitions are the right definition. How do we use the 3 R's effectively? And what I'd suggest to you is using Tim Bergen's approach. I think we can translate and do a better job making our animals happy and making better discoveries. So I think thinking about wolves in relation to your laboratory dogs is going to be important. I think thinking about cavies as it relates to your guinea pigs or whatever the wild progenitor of your domesticates are is really, really important. And also acknowledging the fact that your monkeys are wild. They're not domesticated is really super important in thinking about social housing. Okay, so I'm going to skip these two slides, but the point was just to say that by thinking about evolution and how these species evolved, we did a better job measuring their psychology, where we were failing, like in that cup test I did with Fifi, to find sophistication. When we took a Tinbergen approach and we took into account the fact that primates are so competitive, we started to see abilities that we didn't think existed, but they exist in a competitive context, not in a cooperative, communicative, human-centric context. So all these things basically say that primates are as sophisticated as you might think they are. They know what you can see and what you can't see, and they are paying attention to you when you're coming in and interacting with them. So let me get specifically to welfare using Tinbergen, though. If you don't know the work of Georgia Mason, I definitely think you want to go check it out. I think she's probably a leader in welfare research, and I love her approach. So this is just a pictograph of her study on mink. She asked mink what they prefer. They had to move a heavy door if they wanted more toys, or they wanted to go out into a bigger enclosure, or if they wanted more food, or if they just wanted to hang out in water. Okay? So if you had a human-centric view, you'd think, well, geez, I probably want space or toys, or maybe I just want to sit around and eat a lot of food. Well, guess what she found? The number one thing, and it's a massive effect, if you're a mink, you want water. I don't care about food. I'll move a giant heavy door to get into water because they have evolved a predisposition to really be attracted and enjoy water. And they don't want more toys as much as they want water. You wouldn't have known that if you didn't ask them. Another one of her beautiful studies, this is looking at can you predict or relate of the health of animals in captivity based on their natural ecology. So this is looking at home range size and looking at infant mortality and also looking at stereotype frequency. So if you're at the zoo, the pacing, right? How often do animals, and this was a zoo population, this is looking at zoo animals. And what she found was that animals with large home ranges, their infants don't do as well as captivity, and they tend to show a lot of these stereotype behaviors. So there are ways to think about how animals have been designed and understand how they might perform in captivity. Finally, there's a new study just out this week. I threw this in here because it has to do with social. In meerkats, it ends up meerkats at zoos, if they're in larger group sizes, as zoo visitors appear and come and visit them, they show a lower stress response. Basically, meerkats that are in smaller groups of 2 or 3 are much more stressed out. When they're in bigger groups, they're much more relaxed as zoo visitors are coming. And they were able to control for a lot of variables. I thought that was really interesting because I think it goes along with the idea that in many species, and think about a meerkat that suffers high predation, you know, having these giant predator-like things walking around staring at you all the time, when we now know animals are very sensitive to attention, and we've got the nice controlled studies to show that, that's very stressful. And yes, I live in a social group, and I depend on my social group to reduce the chance I'll be preyed on. So I want to be in a bigger group. This is a slide I had to get to. So let me try to wrap up on this slide. So think about wolves, cavies, and your wild monkeys. The difference really between them is your cavies and your dogs have both been domesticated. And what I would submit to you, as we saw in Belayev's experiment, is that's a real biological genetic process. They are different, and they evolved to be with people. Our monkeys did not, primates did not. And so that's going to inform how we think about social housing, all the strategies we use and the policies we make and where we need to put the most effort. So I just have some things that we worry about: the effect of human rearing, human attention, dominance, strange fear of conspecifics, of strange conspecifics, strange humans, and then aversion, attraction to specific conspecifics. In dogs, what I would say is pretty much all these things are not particularly stress-inducing relative to wolves and relative to other non-domesticated animals. But here's the really important one for dogs. There are beautiful studies showing that if you give dogs the choice between being with other dogs or being with people, if they are socialized dogs, they want to be with people. It's not that they don't want to be with dogs. If the choice is between nothing and a dog, I think they choose the dog. But if you give them the choice between people and other dogs, they choose dogs. Wolves do not make that choice. Even socialized wolves want to be with other wolves. They don't want to be with the people that raise them. So dogs really are attracted to us. They want to be with us. I think that's very, very important. Guinea pigs, I think they look very similar, and probably many of our other domesticated animals you're going to be talking about, rabbits, et cetera, I think they probably are very similar, except for I don't think they have a preference for people necessarily. Now, when we go to our monkeys, I think they really do look different. I think that probably the effect of human rearing is going to be pretty negative in terms of their ability to interact socially with others. I don't think they like to be a human attention. I think they'd be just as happy if a human didn't show up that day, as long as they got fed and water. Obviously, in the case of rhesus macaques, they have a very strict dominance hierarchy, but I hope we all remember that rhesus macaques are one macaque species. For instance, Tonkian macaques, if we had had the blessed accident of having Tonkian macaques as our chosen model species, wouldn't our lives be easier? Because they're sort of like the bonobo of the macaque world, and they like each other, and they like to hang out. It's not that rhesus don't like each other, but they're very, tolerant of one another. Rhesus macaques, I think they're stressed around strangers, whether it's human strangers or it's strangers from another group. Obviously, they migrate or they immigrate when they are going through puberty, and that would be the time where they'd be interested in strangers at that point in their life. But past that, they're pretty happy with their group mates, and they're not really that happy to interact with others they don't know. Do they have a muted HPA axis as a result of domestication? Absolutely not. No, these are wild animals, and they're going to behave like wild animals, even though they've been around humans their whole lives. Okay, so here's some strategies to wrap up, or some implications of thinking this way, is that particularly when it comes to primates, because I feel like this is where this approach really delineates domesticated, non-domesticated, and primates in particular are a challenge. I think we all know that. There's a whole day dedicated, and it was so great to see that that had been put together, of how do we deal with the challenge that primates present us since they're wild animals. And here's some ideas, or here's some things that we need to think about. Mother-reared infants, that's always going to be difficult. Care taken to reduce infanticide when removing members of matrilines. So if you have to remove a member of a matriline, you have a juvenile you want to bring up, and you have a young male you want to bring up and put in a lab situation, well, you might have problems in their social group if you remove too many from any one matriline in infants being injured or molested as a result of a shift in the dominance hierarchy. Group housing with choice of social partner. I think one of the challenges for primates in particular is, and I see that that's going to be dealt with, which is so cool, is how do you choose the right partner for them? I mean, we have beautiful studies showing that chimpanzees are fantastic at cooperating. They can solve all these really complicated cooperative problems as long as they're tolerant with their partner. You can have chimpanzees that understand everything about cooperation. They understand how to solve it, that they need somebody, that they can negotiate. They're incredibly sophisticated. I can turn off their cooperation like that. All I do is pair them with somebody they don't get along with. Totally falls apart. In fact, they might even be aggressive with each other. So how, with the scale of the problem, the number of individuals we have to take care of, how can we identify and come up with a way to select the right relationships where the animals are happy, or happy as we can provide them with, but they're not being aggressive with each other, and the staff doesn't go crazy dealing with the soap opera of primate life. Recognizing the social system and the cognitive abilities. Rhesus macaques know when you're looking at them. They know what you don't know. They know, yeah, that's true. They know what you don't know. They don't know that you know something false, but they know when you haven't seen something, for instance, or you have seen something. And they know when you're looking at them, and of course, generally, rhesus are going to take that as a threat, unlike more tolerant species. So that has important implications for they need places to hide. They need small, especially in small crowded enclosures. They're going to really need a place to get away from each other when at all possible. And familiar caretakers, if at all possible, and I know that it's really hard because there's turnover in staff and, we're talking about a very large scale problem here, but when possible, if they know who they're working with, it's going to help, and integrations of new members obviously need to be carefully planned. I think everybody here would know that, but it's just to reemphasize that strangers in the primate world is a very, very, very scary thing because it often leads to death. So what I'd like to suggest is in my career, I tried very hard to think about the 3 R's as it applied to me. It ended up I had to kind of come up with my own definition and my own approach, but Tinbergen was incredibly powerful for me in solving real-world problems that people didn't think could be solved. Comparative psychology was declared dead. I had people tell me that I should go into systems neuroscience and give up your dream of what you were doing because there's just no way forward. I contest that. I think we came up with some good alternatives, and that, in fact, our field will be healthier than ever. And it was because we didn't give up, and we thought about how our animals would be happy, and that then would turn into translating our science into real-world solutions. And I think using the 3 Rs, it'll help us here, too. Thank you very much.